seeing all the various people who are opposed to Putin, who are opposed to the war, coming behind him. And so that really raises an interesting question of whether Putin can actually afford to have a genuinely liberal, genuinely anti-war candidate on the ballot.
Please, about Boris Nadezhdin.
Sure. I mean, this is a man who's been an opposition politician, frankly, throughout the entire Putin era. I suppose it's very hard to actually put our labels onto them, but you might say he would be regarded as being a liberal, but probably a sort of a liberal, sort of slightly right wing from our politics. He believes very much in sort of economic liberalism as well. And he basically really came out of nowhere. I mean, he was obviously a known figure, but when he originally said that he was interested in standing against Putin for the presidency, quite frankly, I think a lot of people discounted that. And therefore, it's come as something of a surprise that he's got through to at least this final stage in order to get on the presidential ballot. And he's basically polling really quite well in terms of need of signatures. He still needs about 48,000. I checked his website just before coming on, because you have to have a certain number from a certain number of regions. But very much at the moment, we're seeing all the various people who are opposed to Putin, who are opposed to the war, coming behind him. And so that really raises an interesting question of whether Putin can actually afford to have a genuinely liberal, genuinely anti-war candidate on the ballot.
I mean, has this man Boris Nadezhdin has he got what it takes in terms of just support, profile around the country to be taken seriously as a name to be mentioned in a presidential contest? I mean, obviously taking on and beating Putin is a pretty steep task, but has he got what it takes to be seen and taken seriously as a presence in the coming election?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, he would not beat Putin simply because these are not free and fair elections. Nonetheless, the fact is, if he gets on the ballot, he then acquires a sort of a national platform at which he can say things that, frankly, Putin would probably rather not being said there. This is the interesting thing, though. He's a figure who is a kind of a known figure, but he was never regarded as one of the leading lights of the opposition movement, which is probably why he hasn't been poisoned, pushed into exile, or put behind bars like all the others have been. And so, in that circumstance, really, he's just simply become the figurehead. Everyone who is truly dissatisfied with the regime, because the other people who are standing, an ultra-nationalist by the name of Slutsky and the communists, sort of aging candidate, they're not real opposition candidates, and everyone pretty much knows that. So I think it's more that just this is the man around whom everyone unites. So it's not really about him. It's simply about what he represents, that one chance to actually have some kind of real debate in the elections.
Right, but I guess what we know of Vladimir Putin and his brutal way of exercising power in Russia, the more this man Boris Nadezhdin is discussed, then the more risk he's under. Isn't that true?
I think so. I mean, look, I don't think we're imminently going to see him falling out of a window or suddenly falling sick. But I do think that there's going to be some really tough planning at the moment taking place within the presidential administration, because they clearly haven't expected Nadezhdin to make the kind of showing that he has in terms of attracting enough signatures to cross that, really quite a tough hurdle to be on the ballot. So either they're going to do one of two things. Either he will submit his signatures and then the Central Electoral Commission, which is totally controlled by the regime, will turn around and say, no, 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 there's clearly been irregularities, and rule him out on that basis. Or if they do plan, and it's a high risk strategy, so I mean, it'd be quite unusual for it to be done. They do plan to let him stand. They're probably planning on essentially burying him, on manipulating the results so he gets a very, very small fraction of the vote.
Yeah.
And then they can turn around and say, you see, the Russian people all want the current so-called special military operation, in other words, the war in Ukraine, to continue. So either he's going to be excluded or else he's going to be used as an object lesson. And then after the elections, well, then who knows what could happen to him then.
So to what extent is Vladimir Putin, in as far as one can gauge in Russia, truly supported by the Russian public? I mean, the war has taken a toll, chiefly in Russian lives, but also in the quality of life in Russia. What do the public in Russia feel about him?
I think it's difficult. In some ways, it's a little bit like if you go back to, we heard stories that when Stalin died, even people within the awful Gulag labor camps burst into tears in many cases not because they were sorry about the monstrous dictator who put them there, but because almost they could not imagine a world without Stalin. He'd been so pivotal. And likewise, to a degree, Putin is not Stalin, but still, he has been directly or indirectly in charge of Russia for 24 years. There's a whole new generation who don't even remember a pre-Putin Russia. So I think there's clearly diminishing active support for Putin, especially for the war. Probably only about a quarter of Russians actually support the war overall.
Really? Yeah.
But rather, it's just that sense of who else could it be? Putin has almost become something like the weather. You may like or dislike, but basically you endure.
Really fascinating insights, Mark. Thank you. Good to get you on. Mark Galeotti there.